welcome. Good morning, everyone, to Creative Mornings Columbus. I'm your host, David Staley. We begin every month, always, thanking our global sponsors, MailChimp, Basecamp, and Skillshare. This month, I wanted to give a special shout out to one of our sponsors, Moody Nolan. I don't know if you heard it in the news, everyone, but Moody Nolan has won the 2021 AIA Architecture Firm Award, which is the first for any Ohio-based architectural firm and a first for any African-American owned architectural firm. So I'm certain you all want to join me in cheering and congratulating Moody Nolan for this well-deserved honor.
Yay.
And Brian Nassell is on the call. In Zoom world, this is pretty exuberant, I think, for what we get on Zoom. And of course, we're delighted that Moody Nolan has been one of our sponsors. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to remind everyone to post questions in the chat box. We'll curate these, excuse me. And at the end of the talk, we'll have Q&A with our speaker. So go ahead and put those questions in the chat box. And so with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker this morning, who is Laurie VanBalen. She is a visual artist and an advocate for human rights. She informs me that her goal as an artist is to help others find their voices, which she most certainly does, I think, with the Columbus Crossing Borders Project. Along with her husband and co-director Tom, Columbus Crossing Borders Project takes the project into classrooms, using the creative arts to engage with students about the many ways we can all make positive contributions to our communities. Speaking today, this morning, on the theme of divergence, please join me in welcoming Laurie VanBalen.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very grateful to be here today, and I want to thank the team at Creative Mornings. I'm glad to have discovered that I had never seen their show before. So, and I really appreciate being here. I also want to thank all the Columbus Crossing Borders participants, the artists in the exhibit, and the people who have shared their stories of escape and fleeing, and the film crew, and certainly our partners at CRIS, which is Community, Refugee, and Immigration Services. I want to start by referring back to the year 1968. I was 14 years old, and I had three heroes: John Lennon, Mother Teresa, and Robert Kennedy. Each of these heroes existed in my mind alongside a quote, something they'd said that inspired and symbolically embodied the things that they strived for in their work. John Lennon's quote was, "Peace is not something you wish for. It is something you make, something you do, and something you are, and something you give away." Mother Teresa said, and I quote this a lot, "Not all of us can do great things, but we can all do small things with great love." And Robert Kennedy, in his eloquence, said, "Each time a person stands up for an ideal or helps to improve the lives of others or strikes out against injustice, that person sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, crossing from a million different directions and building a current that can sweep away the mightiest walls of resistance and oppression." So during that time in 1968, it wasn't all that different than it is now, in the sense that there was a lot of social unrest and profound change. There were riots, student protests, civil rights, women's rights, and more, as well as a very phenomenal culture explosion that was taking place. My three heroes were traveling divergent paths: a musician, a nun, a politician, all of them contributing something positive to our world in their own ways. I'm not certain whether any of them knew each other, although I do know that they were not friends hanging out together. And yet they were allies, making caring contributions and coexisting within their missions of unity and peace. They were working passionately on issues that reflected taking care of our world and taking care of each other. Their actions contributed great light during a time that was very dark, And that light continued on even through the darkest of times when we lost one of those heroes when Robert Kennedy was assassinated that year in June. So fast forward to 50 years later, and I'm sitting at my home computer with a cup of coffee, reading the latest news, when a photo catches my eye. It's a scene from Aleppo. I see burned out buildings, massive destruction, the remnants of violence, and there's a woman running and her mouth is open with what looks like a desperate cry, and she's clutching a baby to her chest. The look on her face was haunting, and something overcame me at that moment. There was a sudden awareness with a feeling I'll never forget. It's as though all at once I woke up to the terror that is really happening to this woman and to millions of others like her. And it was that weird connection where my heart was pounding and this light went on in my head. And I realized these are not just images. I couldn't desensitize myself anymore. It came to me, this is really happening to mothers, fathers, store clerks, physicians, teachers, and over half of the people it's happening to are children. And all they're asking for is that same safety that you and I want and deserve. Connecting that to that reality that exists in the life of a refugee can seem very far away and surreal, especially as we're sitting here now in the warmth of our homes or offices, comfortable, drinking coffee, and we're gathered on Zoom. But at that moment that I sat there staring at my computer screen, the reality of that refugee crisis hit me like a wave of great urgency. And I started thinking about the world we live in with its madness and its grief, and how can we let these kinds of things happen? The overwhelming momentum, the war games, the power of politics, the people who care, the people who don't care. And I thought, what's my place in all of this? I felt like I needed to do something to help, but what? I mean, I'm just this person in Ohio. I have no credentials for solving world problems. So what would I say? What would I do? And why would anybody want to listen to me? I mean, it's not like I'm some kind of superhero. And then I thought about my heroes. And suddenly the answer was in those quotes. Peace is something you make, something you do, and something you are. Thank you, John Lennon. Not all of us can do great things, but we can all do small things with great love. Thank you, Mother Teresa. And every time a person stands up for an ideal or helps to improve the lives of others or strikes out against injustice, that person sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, crossing from a million different directions. Thank you, Robert Kennedy. So I was ready to get to work and create my tiny ripple of hope. And being that I'm an artist, then art would be my toolkit. So at that time in December of 2016, there was a lot of talk about building walls and travel bans, accompanied by these shocking new immigration policies that were being prepared by the new president that had just been elected, the new administration, and there was a great deal of misinformation sweeping through this country about refugees and immigration in general. I was mindful at that time that there were a lot of people who were and still are unfamiliar about the plight of refugees or unsure about their feelings toward refugees. And frankly, the lack of awareness and critical thinking on the part of so many people deeply concerned me. But I also knew some otherwise very caring people who were falling for the fearful thinking and the propaganda and the myths that were being perpetuated about refugees. So as I pondered how I wanted to address all of this, I thought about our family friend, Bull. Now, some of you know Bull. In fact, there are at least 2 people here this morning who are closely connected to him coming to the United States and getting his life started here. Some of you may have heard him speak. He's done a wonderful TED Talk. However, I want to talk about Bull as he is an artist, the same as I'm an artist, but he became an artist in a much different way. A little over 30 years ago, when he was 6 years old, he was living in a village in his homeland of Sudan. His village was very beautiful, and it thrived as a cooperative community where everyone had their community chores that they all performed daily, even the young children. Bull's responsibility as a 6-year-old was to help to tend to the cattle, which was a main source of income in his village. Every day he went with the other boys in the village to take care of the cattle. They'd lead him out to these large bodies of water where they graze on the land out there, and they'd work together. During that time in the 1980s, there was an uprising in Bull's country. Where there's a brutal civil war in Sudan, and it came to claim thousands of lives. Terrorist armies were invading the village, like the one that Bull lived in, and these armies would attack, torture, rape, kill, and they would kidnap these young boys like Bull and recruit them into their fundamentalist troops. Because Bull's village had received word from other villages that these invasions were taking place, the villagers needed to prepare what they would do in case this should happen. So they hatched a plan for the young boys. If and when the army came, the boys were to flee into the jungle and follow the river for hundreds of miles to the neighboring country of Ethiopia. And then they would also need to, after that, make their way to the country of Kenya, which was another 600 miles or so away. So it's the kind of thing that you would see it maybe in a movie, but in Bull's life, it was very real because that day arrived. And Bull and his group of young friends were heading back to the village after tending to the cattle, and they saw their community was under attack. So they immediately did as they'd been told. They fled into the jungle, and there were many boys who fled, but they'd been warned that for safety reasons, they needed to break into smaller groups. So they did, and the boys in Bull's group ranged in age from 5 to 12 years old. And all they had with them were the clothes they were wearing. They walked for a long time following the river as they'd been told to do, and they were vulnerable to severe weather, heat exhaustion, illness, starvation, and they stayed alive by eating plants. Bull told me there was this one plant that was abundant in the jungle and he could eat it and survive, but the problem was there was another plant that looked just like it that was poisonous. But when you're starving, you take that chance, and a lot of the kids died. One of the gravest dangers that these boys faced was predators. They'd been walking over rough terrain for days and days, and their shoes were wearing out. And as a result, their feet were cut up by the rough terrain and stones, and they were getting injured and they were bleeding. The animals smelled the blood and they started to track them. And that's how Bull came to see some of his friends attacked and killed by lions. He told me that he and the boys in his group figured out that if they joined hands tightly and screamed and waved when a lion approached, that they could sometimes appear to be bigger than that creature and more powerful, and sometimes they could scare these predators off. But ultimately, the impulse to run would be too great, and some of the boys would panic and run and be killed. There were poisonous snakes, wild animals, the things you'd imagine in a jungle. And of course, there was always the danger of the terrorist army that was not far away and could find them at any time. But after weeks of walking, these boys finally made it to Ethiopia. And there was a camp there that had been set up for all these children who'd been fleeing. Hundreds of kids arrived to this camp daily, and there wasn't sufficient food or medical care, but it was safer than living in the jungle. So Bull stayed in the camp for 4 years, and then the terrorist army found them. So the boys had to flee again, and this time they had to cross a river to escape. This time, gunfire and alligators took even more lives, and Bull said there were so many boys killed and injured during this one attack that the water was turning red with bloody bodies everywhere. Somehow he and the other boys who survived did get to Kenya, and Bull was there for 9 years. He received schooling, began to create artwork, and he says he began painting from his memory. Painting about his life in Africa, his family, the animals, the beautiful scenery that he remembered in his village. The painting helped him, of course, address the trauma that he had been through. And then eventually the Red Cross helped him find a new life in the United States. The civil war in Sudan separated more than 20,000 children like Bull from their families. Most of these kids were 6 or 7 years old when they were forced to flee to the jungle and walk thousands of miles. Half of them died before they reached Kenya. The survivors of this story are known as the Lost Boys of Sudan. Bull is now a citizen of the United States. He arrived here as a refugee when George Bush was president, and at that time he was allowed to pursue a life of peace and education. He graduated from Ohio State. He's a very serious Buckeye, and he generously raises money to build and support a medical clinic in his homeland in Sudan, where he provides health services. And he named this clinic the Buckeye Clinic, and has raised thousands of dollars to vaccinate thousands of children. He lives in Columbus with his wife and children. He's a remarkable human being. Had he tried to make his home here in the US 4 years ago, when I was starting the Columbus Crossing Borders Project, forget it. His country of Sudan was on the scum list. Remember the 7 countries that were listed on the travel ban? But back then, I was thinking that if I could somehow appeal to people's hearts by pointing them towards courageous stories like Bull's, that if I could somehow create a presentation that would reach beyond the refugee label and introduce a name, a face, a real human being, then maybe I could shine a spotlight on our shared humanity. My instinct was to gather other artists, including a film crew, to utilize art as a means of making that connection, which might help to lead toward more understanding about the hardship and devastation of people who are forced to leave their homes. So by providing an up-close, intimate look into this very personal human struggle, maybe we could give our audience the opportunity to observe, integrate, and connect. So this is what led to the birth of the Columbus Crossing Borders project. Columbus Crossing Borders is an art exhibit and documentary film that was created to inspire critical thinking, compassion, and support for the millions who've been forced to flee due to war, climate, violence, and persecution. The Columbus Crossing Borders art exhibit features a collective contribution of 34 artists who are responding to the plight of refugees with paintings that cross borders and connect. In other words, these artists are asked not to be territorial with their work, allowing instead for their paintings to overlap and integrate harmoniously. As the exhibit moves from left to right, each painting contains an element that reaches into the painting beside it. So you may see a figure moving from one canvas onto the next. Maybe 2 paintings are connected by an intersecting ocean, blades of grass, or maybe the connection is being made with repetitious symbols or designs. Still, in whatever way these border crossings take place, this is an inspirational exhibit that is the result of a cooperative community of artists who have created a beautiful tribute to the resilience and the strength and the courage of those who have survived forced migration. Columbus Crossing Borders is going on its 4th year. The art exhibit has been seen in galleries, museums, schools, colleges, community centers, and places of worship. The Columbus Crossing Borders documentary film is titled Breathe Free, and it was directed by filmmaker Doug Swift. It's a compelling film that follows the creation and development of this project, and it's intermixed with the courageous stories of refugees who are now living in the United States. Breathe Free had its theater premiere in the summer of 2017 at the Drexel Theater, and it was a sold-out audience, which blew us away, and the film continues to be seen throughout the country. The Columbus Crossing Borders events take place in a variety of ways. We have exhibits, school presentations, workshops, public partnerships, panel discussions, creative community projects, all these things. Now, to overcome the restrictions presented by the current pandemic, we've created an online presentation of the art exhibit through a virtual 360-degree gallery tour. And we're going to be releasing this very soon, within days. In this way, the Columbus Crossing Borders project can continue being seen by the public in the many classrooms we visit. Both this virtual tour and our new updated website will be published, like I said, in just a few days. During all of our events, whether they're in person or online, we meet with all ages and all demographics. We have a lot of discussions, and these are opportunities to listen and learn. Something that's become very clear to me, and it's been startling during these past 4 years, is the number of people I talk to who say they feel helpless, they feel powerless. They talk about their concern and their compassion for refugees and related concerns such as racism, poverty, social justice issues. But then there's this like lingering helplessness that so many people say they just don't feel like there's anything they can do to make a difference. This is one of the reasons why and how the Columbus Crossing Borders advocacy developed and came to expand. And I'm going to share with you now a short video that explains that while our project continues to spotlight issues of forced migration, we're also now working on a deep commitment to human rights education.
As we work to help those whose lives have been uprooted by violence, climate, and poverty, the Columbus Crossing Borders outreach includes a deep commitment to human rights education. This commitment is the basis of many of our Columbus Crossing Borders activities and community partnerships, knowing that every one of us has the ability to contribute to the greater good of our world through the upholding of human rights. The Columbus Crossing Borders project meets with schools, organizations, and students of all ages to engage in conversations and creative projects that point to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Through art, we find a creative approach for sharing this vital document and its principles of inclusion, equality, and justice that help to bring about peace in our everyday lives. These group projects produce remarkable displays of painting, poetry, mural making, theater, music, and journaling, all pointing to our goals to live together successfully as human beings. And through such projects that feature our human rights, we can see how, in a nurturing and caring environment, such meaningful activity can reinforce positive views of self, respect for others, and a strong sense of responsibility toward our communities.
So after the end of World War II in 1945, the governments of the world came together. And through the United Nations, they created a milestone document that spells out these basic human rights that are shared by all people. There were representatives from across the world with many different legal and cultural backgrounds, and they drafted these 30 articles, which are known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These rights state that every person's entitled to dignity, freedom, equality, justice, and peace, regardless of race, color, sex, religion, politics, origin, property. They belong to all of us just because we're human beings. The practice of these human rights puts love and peace into action. Remarkable changes happen when communities agree to uphold these rights. And as Eleanor Roosevelt talked about years ago when she worked to bring these into the schools and communities, it begins in small places close to our homes, like our neighborhoods, our schools, our offices, factories, workspaces. These are the areas where we do already expect equality and justice without discrimination. But unless these rights have meaning in these places, they have little meaning anywhere else. So when we uphold them close to home, the progress extends into the larger world. And I like to imagine what our communities might look like if the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were the foundation for our common activities and the way we govern. And what if, from a very early age, these human rights were taught as easily as spelling and math are taught in our schools? What if equality, freedom, justice, and respect were taught and reinforced daily in the safety of a caring classroom? And what if that were to become the cornerstone of our public education system? I don't believe it's at all impractical to imagine this for our communities and for our schools. I think the education of human rights is the single most important step that we can take as a society toward upholding peace and teaching children how to live successfully together as human beings. We need to educate about these rights. We need to integrate human rights into our own communities. Columbus Crossing Borders Project partners with organizations who are working now to do just that. There is quite a movement, and I spent the summer talking to educators across the country who are utilizing the human rights in their classrooms, and they're embedding the study of this into their curriculum. As we consider some of our current world problems, climate change, the pandemic, gun violence, racial justice, LGBTQ rights, poverty, nuclear proliferation, but consider the incredible outcome when many students are being prompted and encouraged to how to apply these rights toward finding solutions for these problems while learning how to work together with divergent groups to find common ground during these polarized times. As you saw in the film that I just shared, that by using art as our base, Columbus Crossing Borders has joined the human rights education movement by working with community organizations and students on a lot of creative projects that encourage critical thinking and meaningful actions in our communities. We introduce projects that are age appropriate for each classroom, and we work with teachers to integrate these activities, all contained within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And shortly before the pandemic began, my husband and I took the Columbus Crossing Borders exhibit and film to visit with elementary school students. We visit all ages, but these were groups of second and third graders. I shared Bull's story with them. Afterwards, we had quite a discussion. We talked about the importance of having a home, what it might feel like to suddenly be told you have to leave your home. If you could only carry one thing with you, what would you take? And many of these young kids brainstormed about what they might take with them to help take care of each other and their families, the people they were traveling with. They talked about taking a jug of water to share, a lighter to make fire, a big blanket to keep a group of them warm. And others considered ways they might lift their spirits and keep each other focused on making this hard journey and how you'd stay strong and healthy while you're trying to find a new home. We talked about how a community is like a shared home. And we talked about the many ways we can open our shared homes to new people. And then we talked about compassion. Is it just something we feel, or is it an action we take? We talked about what it means to show kindness and respect to people who may be different than the people you're familiar with. And then we participated in a group art project where we created these connecting paintings that reflect what we value about our homes and our communities. And they turned this into a visual community quilt. When we encourage this type of critical thinking among kids, seeing how they embrace broader concepts, it's a very uplifting activity. These are groups of enthusiastic youngsters who are troubleshooting and using creative problem solving about ways to generate more unity. It was an hour of critical thinking and a wonderful way to introduce some of the articles that are reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I have no doubt that discussion left a powerful and lasting impression on many of those young people. So it is clearly a gift to work with students like this of all ages. The insights and meaningful conversations and projects that we participate in with these students gives me great hope. Before I'm done, I want to share what two students created based on our visits. One was a fifth grader and the other was a high school student. This is a painting from the Columbus Crossing Borders art exhibit that was done by artist Kathy Anderson. Inspired by this painting, a fifth grader named Chloe wrote a poem titled "Fighting for My Rights." This is what she said. I had to stand up for my rights. I had to deal with slavery. I had to go through racism, but I am here now in school learning how to read and talking to people who are not my color. The next student from Westerville had participated in a project where high school painting students were paired with other same age students who had been willing to share their own experiences as refugees. This collaboration created a very moving display, and the painting students had to create personal statements to accompany their artwork. This painting is by student Taylor Downard, and this is what he said about his work. When you look at this painting, what words come to mind? I'd say it's fair to assume that one of the first words that comes to mind is foreigner, and in some regards, this is true. This is Sam. He was raised in a Nepali refugee camp in Bhutan, and his family moved to the United States when he was 16 years old. Even though in technicality, Sam's a foreigner, he embodies something greater than himself. He is real. Not in the sense that he's not imaginary, but in the sense that he is genuine. He is kind. He is humble. He is thankful for his opportunities. He appreciates the small luxuries of life. Meeting Sam showed me that the word foreigner is just an idea that is used to separate people from one another. It's the people themselves that are in fact real, and that it is this sense of being real that can transcend skin color, nationality, and language barriers to bring people together as one. So the question is, if we really want to remove the barriers of racism and reach hearts and minds with a message of love and compassion, what better place to start than with our school students? Because I think every one of us has a contribution, a voice. Every one of us has the ability to breathe more life into inclusion, equality, and justice. Every one of us has the power to make a better difference so that peace can exist among us. Our shared humanity defines the world we are in. And when there exist 80 million people at this time that are fleeing from terror, and we see families torn apart, marginalized, and criminalized only because they are asking for our help, how can we allow ourselves to be bystanders in misperceptions, lies, and false information that's being spread? Every act that we put forth and every omission matters. We can all do small things with great love. We can all send forth our tiny ripples of hope, and we can all create peace. All we need to do is commit to putting love into action in our many divergent ways. Thank you.
Laurie, I hope you can hear the fulsome applause over Zoom, because it is fulsome, and it's clearly proportional to the power of the talk you just gave. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
So when I introduced you, I said that one of the things that we learned about you the other day when we were talking was you help others find their voices. That's how you define your art. And I think that the Columbus Crossing Borders project is clearly evidence of that.
Well, thank you.
Please post your questions here. I don't know where to start. I have many questions. Or I'd ask you maybe to elaborate on something. You had said that in one of your sessions, I think with students, you were exploring the idea of community as a shared home, and I'd like you to tell us more about explore the depths of that statement.
Well, I think, there's so much I could say about this.
I know.
but I think it's very important right now for people to not only feel empowered, but to realize that they have the power. When you look at the giant scope of what's happening, it can be very overwhelming and you don't know where to start. But when you look in your own little corner, and there's a lot of wonderful people who have said wonderful statements about this, but when you start in your own little corner, you can make such a difference. And my own little corner tends to be a very conservative corner. Conservative.
Meaning?
Politically, conservative in the way people live their lives. I live in Licking County. I live in Pataskala. and sometimes I felt like a fish out of water because it's a very small town that is growing, but I the I tend to meet a lot of people who have not been exposed to greater things. They've not been exposed to a lifestyle outside of Pataskala. And I think that sometimes some of our projects have been focused on bringing people together who might not otherwise have met each other. And so we've done a lot of art projects here, and there are kids here who have never met anybody from another country, and we bring them in. And we have done some wonderful projects together and created that sense of strong community. So in that way, that's the one thing I would want to focus on when I answer your question.
Alan Schwartz had written earlier, what better question for an artist? Tell us more about your what if thinking as an artist, as an activist.
I think Alan could answer that question. He's one of the artists in our project. And he is somebody who lives near my community and has done a lot of the work that I'm talking about, making great changes in so many different ways. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I would indeed like to hear more, both either from you or from Alan about that, because
I think Alan should talk.
Please.
Let's see, maybe I could show you my face. There we go. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And we can all see you. Thank you, Alan.
I'm an artist and a musician, and I live even a little further out in Licking County than Laurie does. And I've lived in a lot of places in the United States. And two things that are lacking in Ohio and that I've discovered in our work is a kind of a lack of imagination and a lack of sense of irony to deal with the contradictions of life and the subtleties of life. Everything ends up being very black and white without irony. So the question, what if, is not only a good question for artists, but it's the question for political activists as well. Just trying to get people to dream about something better. People don't think about what is the proper function of a government or a proper function of a society. They don't ask themselves that. Is it to provide for all of their citizens, whether they are citizens or not, whatever age, whatever color? People lose that expectation of society. So artists have a great role in trying to restore that expectation of what we need to expect of ourselves, our society, and the people who govern us.
Well, imagine if asking what if were the central foundation of schooling. Not a sort of a side project or something that, well, we'll do that over here. We'll let the art class do that, which is like, once a week or something like that. What if asking and answering the question, what if, were the basis of schooling? And I know I just asked a what if question, but okay.
Critical
and then
thinking.
Some support for a student, and then some support for a student who wants to start his answer or her answer with the words, I wonder.
Even better, yes.
Yeah.
I wonder.
Critical thinking is something that has not been clearly celebrated by a lot of educational institutions in the last 15, 20 years. I mean, we've resorted to so much multiple choice. And I'm really impressed when I go to schools and the teachers are focused on that social emotional learning and to try to again give people back their ability to speak. I think a lot of people feel that the only thing they can do anymore is vote, and there's so much more people can do.
Laurie, I think you were talking about, I think it was one of your gallery showings. I think this was the case. You said it was an opportunity to listen. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about listening, which I think is an undervalued skill in our society.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and we're so polarized right now, right? I mean, it's very difficult to understand where people are coming from, and I think that unless you ask and you listen, you're not going to know. We're so busy assigning identities to people based on you know their political choices or their whatever kind of work they might do. But I've really made a point of trying to listen to people, because I feel like we're jumping to too many conclusions, particularly when it comes to something as emotionally charged as the refugee crisis.
Indeed.
It's, in my mind, it's very difficult to understand why we can't get past those labels that we assign to people. But there's a lot of people who have, there's that fear has been stoked, and they're immediately going to think that if somebody is from a particular country, or if they're coming from the southern border. I mean, like I said, I know a lot of otherwise very caring people who don't want to let anybody in right now. And of course that was being propagated for the last few years as well on a national level. So it's not going to do any good to isolate and to try to separate even further. I try to listen to why people, now of course if they're coming from a very racist mindset, I'm not going to listen. But if it's people who are just generally uninformed, I want to understand what they're thinking. So that is again what seeded. You know, you can talk about the refugee crisis and do everything you can to try to help people who are coming over, but how are we going to prevent the kinds of things that lead to this? And that's why that's what seeded the whole idea when I started meeting people who were working on human rights education, including the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Center. They've got a wonderful educational outreach going on to teach people about the refugee crisis.
So Laurie, how about one final question? This submitted by Michael Benish. How receptive have school systems been? Have they all been welcoming? Have you had any objections from administrators or parents?
Good question.
Indeed.
Yeah, real good question. Some of the schools that I was very surprised to be welcomed so readily, but I've met some resistance, and it's once you get in and they see what you're doing. This started when I started this out. This is nonprofit, this is nonpartisan, this is non-denominational, this is just a humanitarian project. But it became a hot political topic. So you know, right away, I think schools are going to they're going to feel you out and see where you're coming from. How are you going to approach this? So that's why I share stories like Bowl, because it has nothing to do with anything other than this young child trying to survive. But a lot of the schools, until they know us, although we've developed quite a reputation, they're going to until they know us. Once they know us, they're going to be more welcoming. And there's some people here today who are members of schools that have hosted us, and they have a good standing in the community and good visibility, and they hear, well, you know, you've been to Lakeland at college, then then you know, yes, we want you here. Or you know, we were in Painesville. I think Tina's here, and Tina is a minister with the church that brought us to Painesville, and we were at the schools there. And once you start developing this network of people, then people are probably a lot more receptive to you.
Well, Laurie, I want to thank you once again for a terrific talk, and I think one of our takeaways from this will be maybe going back to something we were asking at the very beginning. How can one engage in divergent thinking? Maybe divergent thinking starts just by asking the question, what if? Or I wonder. Maybe that's the origins of divergent thinking. One more round of fulsome Zoom applause for Laurie VanBalen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We still have the room if people want to stay and continue the conversation. Let me just remind everyone that we will gather again next month on March 19th. The theme next month is Ripple, and our speaker will be Meghna Mahambri, again on the theme Ripple. So I hope you're able to join us again next month. Thank you all for joining us. Again, we can stay in the room here for a little bit. I have to leave, I'm afraid. I would like to be able to stick around, but I'm afraid I have students to teach. And I think we're going to ask what if today. So thank you all. See you all next month.